Hello and welcome to another episode of Read With Me. I am Tika Masuku and I'm a human geographer and workplace strategist. In my daily job, I help organizations with their workplace strategy, meaning that I support them in the understanding of what type of workplace environments they need so that their people can perform at their best and also for the broader organizational success. With the Read With Me series, we look into human geography insights that we then apply to the world of work and place. I do that on a daily basis with the workplace strategy advice that we offer, but I think it's so important as well to share more insights from human geography for people in the real estate sector because it's very relevant and human geography is just not often heard of. So that's why I started the series, and we've kicked the series off with a book called Topophilia, which was written by Professor Yi-Fu Tuan in 1974. In the previous two episodes we discussed the chapters up to and including chapter 4, and today we will look into chapters 5, 6 and 7. In order to explain the content of the chapters that we are going to go through today, I want to share with you a framework I often use to describe what a human geography is. Because within that framework, we can then situate the chapters we will be looking into today. So on the screen, you see the two bubbles, people and place. So I like to describe human geography as the understanding of the interrelationship between people and place. So how do people affect and impact the built environment? So how do our behaviors and our ways of doing things influence the development of places and the overall environment? And then from a place perspective, how do places influence and shape human behavior and environmental attitudes? You could see it as similar to anthropology, which is about the study of human behavior, but in workplace strategy we take the spatial components into account a lot more. Now, if we overlay this with the chapters that we are going to look into today, we will see the following. So in chapter 5, Yi-Fu Tuan speaks about our personal world. So how does our own personal beliefs, our egocentric viewpoint, affect how we experience place? In chapter 6, it's not about our personal egocentric viewpoint, but it is about that ethnocentric viewpoint. So how does culture influence our experience of place and the cultures that we grow up in, but also the groups of people that we may associate with and how that impacts how we experience place. So if you relate this back to the previous episode where we spoke about egocentric viewpoints and ethnocentric viewpoints. So egocentric very much applies to chapter 5 about the personal world, the ego, and then ethnocentric viewpoints apply to chapter 6, which is about the cultural and the group preferences and experiences. Now chapter 7 then is about the environment. So how does the environments that we may have experienced in the past influence how we experience current spaces and places? Okay, I hope that makes sense. Let's delve into chapter 5. And chapter 5, Yi-Fu Tuan starts with saying the following. As a species, human beings are highly polymorphic. Now, what does polymorphic mean? Poly means many and morphic means forms. So applying that to human beings, it means that human beings can appear in many different forms. Now, this is something that I think is, of course, quite well known. I don't really use the word polymorphic myself, but we often hear people speak about every human being is different, we are all different, and there are no two of us in the world. So why is this important to understand from a human geography perspective? Why does Yi-Fu Tuan start off chapter 5, which is about personal worlds, saying that we are highly polymorphic? Well, it is because in order to understand someone's experience, we really need to dive deep and be curious about that person's experience, because there are so many elements that influence how we, on a personal level, experience place. We may be in the same space, but our realities would differ from one another. Now, Yi-Fu Tuan then gives a few examples of what those type of differences are on a individual basis. But before we go into that, I want to point out something else, which is he writes about how can we do research into understanding people's experiences. And interestingly enough, he says it is not through social science, but he points towards literature. So Yi-Fu Tuan writes that the forceful and precise articulation of environmental attitudes requires high verbal skills. Literature, rather than social science surveys, provide us with the detailed and finely shaded information on how human individuals perceive their words. I think this is really a beautiful observation, because describing how we experience a place is actually a really hard thing to do. In order to find the right words, we benefit from having a rich vocabulary. And the reason why Yi-Fu Tuan points towards literature is because, of course, writers often have this incredibly large vocabulary that they can tap into to really precisely and as close as possible articulate what those experiences are that the characters would go through when they walk through certain places. So, tapping into literature rather than social science. What we are seeing today is that, compared to 1974, when this book was written, now in the year 2025, we actually do have access to lots of different types of technology and trackers in order to understand how a person is experiencing a certain place. This reminds me of a conference session I joined last year in Berlin. This was organized by Cornet Global, and they had invited a couple of young leaders to facilitate one of the breakout sessions. And what I thought was really interesting is that they chose to speak about the topic of workplace distractions, which is quite an interesting topic in and of itself. But what I found even more interesting is how they approached the topic. So you could come at this topic by citing research and data insights, but instead of doing that, they were sharing their own personal workplace experiences when it comes to distractions. What this provided is a very rich storytelling exercise where we as the audience would get a glimpse into their nuanced experience of workplaces, and especially about workplace distractions. So one of the ladies, she gave the example that she could, if she would sit next to a large window, which often in workplaces are high value, highly wanted work points, to sit next to a window and have a view. For her, when she sits next to a view, it becomes this enormous distraction, and she could lose 30 to 40 minutes in productivity because she would be so mesmerized by the view and just be completely distracted from her actual work. I thought it was so beautiful that those young leaders shared that in a session where they were very open about how they experience places, and you could see that they had really thought deeply about that and what the impact was on how they work, the impact on the physical environment and the distractions that happen in the environment and how that affect them on an individual level. I believe when applying this to workplace strategy, in workplace strategy exercises, a lot of focus is often put on the qualitative data gathering. But the most important information I find is when you go through that qualitative research phase where you're speaking with people and you're understanding the stories, and you can delve deeper into why it is that they experience a certain element. So as a takeaway, because we as human beings are polymorphic, we should also therefore go deeper and beyond the data to truly understand a wider range of experiences rather than just looking at the average. Now, in terms of personal differences, Yi-Fu Tuan gives a couple of examples. So he talks about sensory differences, the difference of our age and the impact on how we experience place. And the last one is differences in cognitive abilities. So senses, age, and cognitive abilities. Now, from a sensory perspective, the types of senses that we have may perform differently. For example, the ability to see color. Some people may be able to see a wider color spectrum than other people. I want to point out this sentence that Yi-Fu Tuan wrote about the ability to hear and see. The world seems static to the deaf and contingent to the blind. This is so interesting because he's basically saying, let's say you're at home. You can see things, but you can't hear, for example, the cars move by, or hear the birds, or hear people talk. So it means that you're observing a quite static world. But he said to the blind, the world is contingent. So even though you can't see anything, you will constantly hear some type of noise. And that's what puts the world in motion, so to say, from an experiential perspective. When it comes to age, I want to point out an example he gives in relation to elderly people. The world contracts for elderly people, not only because their senses lose equity, but because their future is curtailed. As the future shrinks, so does the spatial horizon, and the old can become emotionally involved with immediate events and objects in a way that is reminiscent of the child. So here he is not only speaking about their world becoming smaller because perhaps they are not able to see as much anymore, to hear as clearly, or to be mobile, but also the fact that they don't have much future anymore. So therefore their future is called curtailed, and what's happening immediately in terms of what they experience immediately may be much more focused and therefore more important, and therefore their response to certain things that are happening in the immediate environment may actually affect them much more than people of younger age. And then the third type of differences that Yi-Fu Tuan points out is about our cognitive abilities. So of course our minds are all so distinctive, and that very much has an effect on how we experience place. An example he gives is about our spatial visualization and our skills in how well we can visualize certain spaces from, for example, a floor plan. And I think that's something, of course, that we need to take into consideration when we work in the real estate sector, such as workplace strategists, also designers. Not everyone is able to visualize and understand what a future workplace may look like based on a 2D floor plan. So being able to understand the client's abilities to read plans is very important for the relationship and for the success of the project, that you will be able to utilize the right tools to communicate with your clients. So that was chapter 5. So I think the main takeaway of chapter 5 is really that human beings are polymorphic. We are all different, and therefore when we design workplace environments, it often pays off to not only look at the averages and undertake quantitative surveys, but it's so interesting and important to go that step further and speak with people and hear their stories. Now, chapter 6, as we saw in the beginning, where chapter 5 is focused on that egocentric viewpoint, and chapter 6 we are looking into the role of culture and how that shapes people's environmental perception and values. And the example I want to focus on here, because Professor Yi-Fu Tuan gives a variety of examples, I want to zoom into the visitor versus native example. And I'm going to read a little passage here about how he explores the cultures when it comes to people that are native to a certain environment versus the visitors that are more transient. Visitors and native focus on very different aspects of the environment. In a stable and traditional society, visitors and transients form a small part of the total population. Their views of the environment are perhaps of no great significance. In our mobile society, the fleeting impressions of people passing through cannot be neglected. Generally speaking, we may say that only the visitor, and particularly the tourist, has a viewpoint. The perception is often a matter of using the eyes to compose pictures. The native, by contrast, has a complex attitude derived from his immersion in the totality of his environment. There are so many interesting takeaways in this paragraph here, and it's actually one of the things that I really like about the book Topophilia and about Yi-Fu Tuan's writing style more, in his other works as well, is that what he writes has layers and layers of insights. So every time I read this book, I learn more and I see more things that he explores in his work. It's truly fascinating. So in this passage, there are a couple of things that I want to kind of point out and explore further here. So first of all, let's have a look at the visitor and how they experience a place for the first time. So what he is saying is that the visitor experiences very much from the viewpoint, literally, of the eyes. So it's very much aesthetically focused, and you may even say perhaps superficial. So the experience is led by the eyes. Now, a visitor, being an outsider, also has positives and benefits. First impressions really matter, and you can get a fresh perspective as well. So when it comes to the native, the visitor will be able to have a fresh perspective of a certain environment. From a native's perspective, how they are experiencing the environment, as Yi-Fu Tuan writes, is through immersion. They have lived there for a very long time and they've got this complex relationship with the environment. They would have experienced so many things and they would relate to the environment in a much more deeper sense than just, from the eye viewpoint, but it goes much deeper. When people spend more time in an environment, we also see that they are becoming more adaptable. Another thing that Yi-Fu Tuan points out is that when you are being in a place for over a long period of time, you may not see ugliness and beauty as much anymore. So that aesthetical point kind of fades away into the background in our subconscious. How can we apply this to workplace strategy? Well, often we see that when people have worked for an organization for a long period of time and in the same office environment, when a workplace change comes up, those people are often quite resistant to change. So even though the current workplace may be old and outdated and not functioning that well, because those people have been working from that same environment over a long period of time, they've adapted to that environment and they are working with it. But changing to something new becomes a big obstacle. Now, that notion of human beings being adaptable and we kind of make it work as we live somewhere over a very long time can also mean that we may not observe certain things anymore, and that's what makes the visitor perception of so much value. I would be curious to know if you've got an example yourself about where you've been in an environment for a long time and then you had visitors over and they pointed something out that you actually maybe had totally forgotten about or just experienced as normal. One other aspect of this paragraph here is the mention of time. So Yi-Fu Tuan pointed out that in a traditional society, that transient people on the move, form a smaller part. But in our mobile society, the fleeting movement of people is much more prevalent. Now, in our society, when he wrote the book, that was in 1974. Now we are more than 50 years later. And our world has become even more mobile. And therefore there are so many more transient people everywhere. How does this affect places? How does this affect how people experience workplaces? Because workplaces, we've also seen that not only, many populations are becoming more mobile, but also the workforce. So first of all, a lot more people have shorter tenures. They don't work for the same employer over, such a long time anymore. Then, of course, we've got flexible working. People may be working from home some days or working from a co-working space and other days working from the office. And then lastly, overall, the workforce is often traveling a lot more between states and maybe even between nations, as air travel has become much more accessible. Now, how is this impacting the workplace? Are people that are of transient nature experiencing the workplace differently compared to people who would be coming in 5 days a week on a quite regular basis? As we saw in Yi-Fu Tuan's example, is that the visitor's viewpoint is much more aesthetically focused. Would that apply to workplaces too? Would it be that as the workplace transitions more towards a transient workforce, would aesthetics become much more important? It's something to think about, and I would love to hear your perspectives and see if you have noticed this in the workplace specifically as well. I would love to hear that. Lastly, chapter 7. This is about the environment and how the environments that we have experienced in the past are shaping our experience of the current. Professor Yi-Fu Tuan starts off by looking into different categories of place that we may have experienced. And he classifies environment into 2 distinctive places here. So he's talking about the carpentered world and the non-carpentered world. And with the carpentered world, he means more of the industrialized environments where you've got lots of squares, rectangles and straight lines, whereas the non-carpentered world is more that organic, untouched, biophilic environment. You could think of a rainforest, for example. And how this affects on people's perception of place, he gives the example of the Müller-Lyer illusion. So on the screen here on the left-hand side, you see those 2 lines. The right one looks a lot larger, but they are actually exactly the same. And similar for the picture on the right, the house, where you've got 2 lines, one that is attached to the window and the other that's closer to the door. Now the one close to the door looks a lot larger, but in fact they are exactly the same size again, the 2 black lines. So the theory or the hypothesis goes that people that live in carpentered world or industrialized cities and towns are much more susceptible to that optical illusion. Because when we are looking at those geometric forms, we can see them in 3D much more clearly than perhaps people that have not grown up in more of that industrialized environment that contains lots of squares and straight lines. Yi-Fu Tuan then goes on to give 2 other examples about snow and one about rainforest, which is very interesting. But the one about snow, he writes that Yet, if the city man should become an avid skier, he soon learns to perceive different qualities in the snow surface and acquires a new vocabulary to designate them. Again, you're speaking here about vocabulary and how important language is, but also the more time you spend in a certain environment, the more equipped you will be to ascertain different elements of the environment, and you will be able to see much more. If you had grown up in a dense rainforest, would you experience the world, the more open places, differently? Well, this is a research that Yi-Fu Tuan shares in the book Topophilia, and I think this is very interesting. I will read out a passage that was written by the researcher. When I told Keynes that the insects were buffalo, he roared with laughter and told me not to tell such stupid lies. When Henry, which is another researcher, who was thoroughly puzzled, told him the same thing and explained that visitors to the park had to have a guide with them at all times because there were so many dangerous animals, Keynes still didn't believe, but strained his eyes to see more clearly and asked what kind of buffalo they were, that they were so small. I told him they were sometimes nearly twice the size of a forest buffalo, and he shrugged his shoulders and he said he would not be standing out there in the open if they were. I tried telling him that they were possibly as far away as from Apulu to the village of Kopu, beyond Eboyo. He began scraping the mud off his arms and legs, no longer interested in such fantasies. I think this is just so interesting, because it means that Keynes, who is only used to very dense rainforest, now he's being taken to an open land. He is not able to perceive that the buffaloes are at a much further distance away. In his mind, the buffaloes are just close by, like in the rainforest, everything is kind of in near distance, and therefore he doesn't perceive them as far away, but he just perceives the buffaloes as small insects. I think this is, absolutely fascinating. What is it that we experience in our environment and perhaps in our past environments that make us perceive the current world differently? I wonder whether, when it comes to, open versus enclosed workplaces, people who have always worked in cubicle workplaces or in offices, when they are being moved to open plan offices, I wonder whether they would struggle much more by experiencing the complete open workplace and may stick to their own desk much more compared to, let's say, students who have been getting used to open plan environments through their college experiences and then working in open workplace environments in their first jobs. They may be able to experience the workplace in a much more open sense and actually looking further away and taking everything in compared to the people that are used to being in cubicles or in enclosed offices and did not take in that complete workplace. If that makes sense. I wonder what your thoughts are about this. Would love to hear that. I also wonder these days, we all spend so much time on our phones. I call this our rectangle life. We are looking at rectangles all day long. You're most likely looking at a rectangle right now. And because we spend so much time with our phones, how does that affect how we experience the real world? Many of us open our phones more than 150 times a day. We spend more than 7 hours a day engaged in digital activities. Surely this would alter how we experience the real world around us. And what about children and infants who grow up with the screen from a very young age? Would they inherently experience the world differently from people that did not grow up with those screen-focused childhood experiences? Those were the insights from chapter 5, 6 and 7. I hope you found it of interest. As a quick summary, we spoke about chapter 5 about the personal world and how it is so important to undertake qualitative studies and go deeper to truly understand people's individual experiences and be curious about their individual eccentricities. We then spoke in chapter 6 about the cultural influence on people's place experiences, where we looked at the differences between the native and the visitor groups and how that would impact how a more transient workforce would impact workplace experiences. And then lastly, we had chapter 7, where we looked at how do our past lived experiences in environments affect our current lived experiences. In the next episode, we will look into chapters 8 and 9 and delve deeper into those topophilic feelings specifically when it comes to the people-place interrelationship. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any specific questions about human geography or workplace strategy, please leave them in the comments. I would love to hear from you, and I look forward to see you in the next episode. Thank you for reading with me.